Sometimes the deepest pain comes not from dying, but from being the only ones left alive. In a world where hope has frozen to death, even the strongest must choose between survival and dignity. In the village of Ravenshollow, two sisters knelt in the snow before a dark stranger on horseback. They had nothing left, no family, no home, no future. "Please be our husband today," they begged, willing to give up everything for just one more day of life. The man who dismounted was Aldric, a vampire who had lived for centuries. Everyone expected him to take what desperate people always offered. Instead, he did something no one saw coming. He took off his cloak and covered their shaking bodies. But why would a creature of darkness show mercy to two broken souls? Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, subscribe, because tomorrow we have something extraordinary waiting for you. The village of Ravenshollow had not heard the sound of its church bell for 3 months. Where once it had marked the hours of a thriving community, now only wind whistled through the empty bell tower, carrying the scent of ash and forgotten prayers. Snow covered everything: the abandoned market stalls, the broken cartwheels, the small mounds that marked hastily dug graves when there had still been people alive to dig them. Elena pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as she picked her way through the ruins of what had been the baker's shop. At 19, she moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned that every step might be her last if she wasn't paying attention. Her dark hair hung in matted strands around a face that had once been plump with youth and good health. Now her cheekbones stood sharp against pale skin, and her brown eyes held the hollow look of someone who had seen too much death. "Elena, I found something," came a whisper from the shadows behind the collapsed oven. Mira emerged, holding a small sack of flour, dusty and partially spoiled, but still edible if they were careful. At 17, she had been the beauty of the family: golden hair that caught sunlight, blue eyes that sparkled with laughter, a smile that could charm fresh bread from the baker's wife. The plague and winter had taken her softness, but not her spirit. Where Elena had grown hard and cautious, Mira somehow retained a flicker of hope that tomorrow might be better than today. "Good girl," Elena whispered back, taking the sack and examining it carefully. "This will make soup for 3 days if we're careful." They had learned to whisper. Sound carried too far in the empty village, and there were things in the winter darkness that followed voices: desperate people who had lost their humanity, along with everything else. Wild animals driven mad by hunger, and sometimes worse things that Elena preferred not to think about. The sisters had survived when everyone else had perished, through a combination of luck, caution, and Elena's fierce determination to keep Mira alive. When the plague came through Ravenshollow in late summer, taking their parents within a week of each other, Elena had made a promise over their shared grave that she would protect her younger sister no matter what came next. What came next was war. Baron Corvus, whose lands bordered their valley, had decided that the chaos of plague made it the perfect time to expand his territory. His soldiers came through like locusts, taking anything of value and burning what they couldn't carry. Those villagers who had survived the sickness found themselves facing armed men who saw no difference between rebels and refugees. Elena had hidden herself and Mira in the root cellar beneath their family's modest home for 2 days and nights, while the soldiers ransacked everything above. They had listened to boots walking over their heads, heard furniture being smashed, watched through a crack as flames consumed their father's carpentry workshop. When they finally emerged, Ravenshollow was a graveyard covered in snow. That had been 6 weeks ago. Since then, the sisters had survived by scavenging what the soldiers had missed, sharing the body heat of their single remaining blanket, and eating anything that wouldn't kill them: bark soup, the last preserved vegetables from abandoned cellars, even grass when they could find it beneath the snow. Elena knew they were dying. Not quickly, like their parents had died from fever and bloody cough, but slowly, one cold night at a time. Mira still talked about spring, about finding other survivors, about rebuilding, Elena let her sister dream because hope seemed to be the only thing keeping Mira's spirit alive, but Elena could count their remaining days on her fingers. They were down to their last meal, their clothes were falling apart, and the winter storms were getting worse. Tonight, as they shared a thin soup made from the flour and melted snow, Elena made a decision that she had been avoiding for weeks. Tomorrow, they would leave Ravenshollow. They would walk the forest road toward the next valley, where rumor said there might be people still alive. It was probably a death sentence, two young women alone on dangerous roads in winter, but staying was certainly one. "Mira," she said carefully, "tomorrow we need to leave." Her sister looked up from her wooden bowl, steam rising around her thin face. "Leave? But this is home." "Home is gone," Elena said gently. "We need to find people, living people, maybe in Millbrook or beyond." Mira set down her bowl and reached into her bodice, pulling out a small object wrapped in cloth. Elena's heart clenched as she recognized it, their mother's ring. A simple band of silver with a tiny chip of blue stone. It had been passed down through 3 generations of their family. "I've been saving this," Mira said quietly, "for when we really needed it." "We can't eat a ring," Elena replied, though her voice was gentle, "but we can trade it for passage or protection or—" Mira's voice broke slightly. "Elena, I know what you're thinking. About the road, about what happens to women traveling alone." Elena looked into her sister's eyes and saw that for all her dreams of spring and rebuilding, Mira understood their situation as clearly as she did. The knowledge sat between them like a third person at their meager table. "There are stories," Mira continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "about travelers on the forest road, merchants sometimes, or soldiers, men who might if we offered—" "Mira. Not for love, Elena. Not for anything real. Just for protection. Just to survive." Mira's fingers closed around the ring. "Mother always said a woman must be practical about these things. That sometimes—" Elena reached across and took her sister's hands in both of hers. They were so cold, even sitting next to their small fire. "Listen to me. We will find another way." But even as she said it, Elena knew they both understood the mathematics of desperation. 2 young women, alone, with winter closing in their choices, were limited, and none of them were good. They could starve here in the ruins of home, or they could risk the road and whatever dangers it held. And if they met a man who seemed strong enough to keep them alive through winter, what price would he demand? Their mother had been a practical woman, born to a generation that understood survival sometimes required unthinkable compromises. She had married their father not for love that had come later, but because he was a skilled craftsman who could provide security. In the world their mother had known, women married for protection and hoped love might grow from pragmatism. "If it comes to that," Elena said finally, "I'll be the one." "I'm 17, Elena. That's old enough to— You're my sister, and I promised Mother I would take care of you. That's the end of it." They finished their soup in silence, each lost in her own thoughts. Outside, the wind was picking up again, rattling the broken shutters of their abandoned home. Elena banked their fire carefully. Fuel was precious, and they curled together under their shared blanket as they had every night for 6 weeks. As Mira's breathing deepened into sleep, Elena lay awake, staring at the ceiling where snow filtered through gaps in the damaged roof. Tomorrow, they would pack what little they owned and begin walking toward an uncertain future. She thought about her sister's ring, about the kinds of men they might encounter on the forest road, about the conversation they might need to have with a stranger who had the power to save or destroy them. She had heard stories too. Tales of merchants who travelled with guards, of minor nobles who maintained small households even in these troubled times, of soldiers who might be persuaded to provide escort in exchange for services. The thought made her sick, but not as sick as the thought of watching Mira slowly starve to death in the ruins of Ravenshollow. Elena closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's voice, her practical wisdom about the world and women's place in it. Sometimes Her mother had said once while teaching Elena to mend clothes. Life gives us no good choices, only choices we can live with and choices we cannot. The art is learning the difference. Tomorrow, Elena thought, she would discover whether she possessed that art. Miles away, moving through the same forest that Elena and Mira would soon enter, a figure rode alone through the falling snow. Aldric the Deathless had many names, some given by admirers, others spat by enemies, most forgotten by all but himself. For 8 centuries he had walked the earth, fighting wars that mortals started and immortals finished, accumulating power and wealth and reputation until none of it meant anything anymore. He was tired, not the physical exhaustion that mortals felt, but a weariness that went deeper than bone, deeper than blood. He had seen empires rise and fall, watched plagues sweep away civilizations, observed the endless cycle of human hope and despair until it all began to feel like the same story told over and over again. Tonight, he sought only solitude. His black destrier, a creature nearly as supernatural as its master, picked its way carefully through the snow-laden forest paths. Aldric had been riding for 3 nights, avoiding the main roads where desperate humans might seek his attention. He wanted no company, no responsibilities, no reminders of the mortal world and its endless suffering. But the wind carried scents that spoke of recent death, of abandoned places where life had once flourished. Despite himself, Aldric found his attention drawn toward the valley, where smoke had once risen from a dozen chimneys. Now only one thin thread of grey rose into the winter sky, so faint it was barely visible against the storm clouds. His horse snorted and shook its mane, sensing its master's changing mood. Aldric had learned long ago to trust the instincts that had kept him alive through 8 centuries of war and wandering. Something in that dying valley called to him not the promise of blood or easy prey, but something else, something that reminded him of what he had once been, before the darkness claimed him. Against his better judgment, he turned his mount toward the village of Ravenshollow. The forest road was worse than Elena had imagined. What had once been a well-maintained path connecting Ravenshollow to the wider world was now little more than a suggestion beneath 2 feet of snow. Ancient oaks and pines pressed close on either side, their branches heavy with ice that occasionally crashed down without warning. Every step forward required careful testing. A hidden root or stone could turn an ankle, and an injured traveler in winter was a dead traveler. Elena walked ahead, using a broken branch to probe the snow, while Mira followed in her footsteps. They had been walking since dawn, carrying everything they owned in a single cloth bundle, the last of their flour, a wooden cup, a knife their father had made, and Mira's precious ring wrapped carefully in a scrap of linen. "How much farther, do you think?" Mira asked, her breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. "I don't know," Elena admitted. The miller's son used to say it was half a day's walk to Millbrook, but that was in summer, on a clear road. They had seen no other travellers. No fresh tracks in the snow, no smoke from travellers' fires, no sign that anyone else was foolish enough to brave the winter roads. Elena tried to tell herself this was good. Fewer people meant fewer dangers, but the emptiness of the forest felt ominous. In better times, this road would have carried merchants, pilgrims, even the occasional noble's carriage. Now it felt like walking through a world abandoned by the living. The sound of hoofbeats reached them just as the winter sun was beginning its early descent toward the horizon. Elena grabbed Mira's arm and pulled her behind the massive trunk of an oak tree. They pressed themselves against the rough bark and listened as the steady rhythm of a single horse grew closer. "What if it's soldiers?" Mira whispered. Elena peered carefully around the tree. Through the falling snow, she could make out a dark figure on horseback moving toward them with the unhurried confidence of someone who feared nothing the road might offer. The horse was huge, a destrier built for war, and its rider sat straight in the saddle despite the storm. "Just one man," Elena whispered back. "Not soldiers." The rider drew closer, and Elena could see more details. He wore a heavy, dark cloak with a deep hood that shadowed his face. No visible weapons, though that meant little. A man who rode alone in winter was either very dangerous or very foolish, and this one moved with too much purpose to be a fool. Elena felt Mira's hand slip into hers. They both understood what this moment meant. Here was a man who clearly had resources, a fine horse, good clothing, the confidence to travel alone. He might be their salvation or their destruction, but he was certainly their only chance. "Elena," Mira breathed, "maybe we should—" "I know." Elena's heart was pounding so hard she was surprised the stranger couldn't hear it. "Stay behind me. Let me talk first." Before she could lose her nerve, Elena stepped out from behind the tree into the road. The effect was immediate. The dark horse pulled up short, and its rider's hooded head turned toward her with predatory alertness. "Please," Elena called out, her voice carrying farther than she had intended in the cold air. "Please, sir, we need help." The rider sat motionless for a long moment. Elena could feel his eyes on her, though she couldn't see his face beneath the hood. When he finally spoke, his voice was deeper than she had expected, with an accent she couldn't place. "What are you doing on this road?" There was something in his tone, not cruelty, exactly, but a kind of careful distance that spoke of a man who had learned to be wary of desperate people and their requests. Elena forced herself to take another step forward. "We're traveling to Millbrook, sir. Our village, there's no one left. We need to find people, find work." "You're from Ravenshollow." It wasn't a question. The stranger's horse pawed at the snow, eager to continue moving in the cold. "Yes, sir." Elena swallowed hard. This was the moment. Everything depended on what she said next. "Sir, we have nothing left. No family, no home. We're not asking for charity. We can work, or—" She stopped, the words sticking in her throat. "Or?" Elena closed her eyes for a brief moment, thinking of her mother's practical wisdom, of Mira's blue lips and hollow cheeks, of the long winter nights that stretched ahead of them. When she opened her eyes again, she saw that Mira had stepped out from behind the tree to stand beside her. "Please be our husband today," Mira said quietly, the words coming out in a rush before Elena could stop her. "Both of us. We'll share the duty, and we have this—" She pulled out their mother's ring, holding it up so the stranger could see the silver band catch what little light filtered through the storm clouds. "Mira, no." But her sister continued, her young voice steady despite the tremor Elena could hear beneath it. "We're not asking for love, sir, just protection, just a chance to survive until spring. We'll be good wives, we'll work hard, we'll give you no trouble." The stranger went very still. Elena could see her sister's words hitting him like physical blows, though she couldn't understand why. She had expected anger, or lust, or the calculating look of a man weighing an offer. Instead, something that might have been pain flickered across what she could see of his features. "You would offer this to a stranger on a road?" His voice was softer now, almost gentle. "We would offer it to a man who might keep us alive," Elena said, finding her voice again. She moved protectively closer to Mira. "We're not children, sir. We understand what we're suggesting." "Do you?" The stranger dismounted in one fluid movement, landing silently in the snow despite his size. Up close, Elena could see that he was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of unconscious grace that spoke of either noble birth or extensive training in arms. "Do you understand what men like me might demand of women like you?" Elena lifted her chin. "We understand that we'll be dead by spring if we don't find help. Everything else we can endure. Everything else." The stranger pushed back his hood, revealing a face that made both sisters take an involuntary step backward. He was handsome in the way of carved marble, too perfect, too symmetrical, with features that seemed designed by an artist rather than born naturally. His hair was dark, with silver threading through it, though he looked no older than 30. But it was his eyes that made Elena's breath catch. They were grey as winter storms, and they held a depth of weariness that no 30-year-old should possess. "My name is Aldric," he said quietly. and you have just made me an offer that breaks what remains of my heart." He reached up and unfastened his heavy cloak, revealing expensive clothing beneath a dark wool doublet, fine leather gloves, the kind of boots that cost more than Elena's family had seen in a year. When he held out the cloak toward them, neither sister moved. "Take it," he said gently. "You're both shivering." Elena stared at him. "Sir, we don't understand. I am not your husband," Aldric said, wrapping the cloak around both sisters despite their confusion. The garment was impossibly warm, as if it held its own source of heat. "I am not your protector or your savior, but I will not let you freeze on this road tonight." Mira looked up at him with wide blue eyes. "Then what?" "There's an old chapel deeper in the forest, abandoned, but the roof still holds. You'll be safe there tonight, and warm." He turned back to his horse and began untying something from his saddlebags. "Tomorrow, when this storm passes, I'll escort you to people who can truly help." Elena found her voice again. "Why? What do you want from us?" Aldric paused with his hands on the leather straps. When he looked back at them, his strange grey eyes held something Elena couldn't identify. Regret, perhaps, or recognition. "Nothing," he said simply. "I want nothing from you at all. Perhaps that's why I'm the wrong man for you to have met on this road, or perhaps it's why I'm exactly the right one." He pulled a heavy pack from his horse and slung it over his shoulder. "Come, before the real cold sets in." As they followed him deeper into the forest, Elena clutched Mira's hand beneath the warm folds of Aldric's cloak. She didn't understand what had just happened, or why a stranger would show such mercy to two desperate women. But for the first time in months, she felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. Behind them, their footprints filled quickly with fresh snow, erasing all evidence that three souls had passed this way, bound together now by circumstance and the strange alchemy of unexpected kindness. The chapel emerged from the forest like something from a half-remembered dream. Stone walls, darkened by age and weather, rose from a clearing where snow lay undisturbed except for the tracks of small forest creatures. Ivy covered much of the structure, dormant now in winter, but speaking of summers when this place had been left to nature's care. The wooden door hung slightly ajar, secured by neither lock nor bar. "How did you know this was here?" Elena asked, as Aldric pushed the door open with careful pressure, testing its hinges before applying his full weight. "I've travelled these roads many times," he replied, which wasn't quite an answer, but somehow satisfied her curiosity. "The roof is sound, and there's a stone floor that will hold heat. You'll be comfortable here." Inside, the chapel was larger than it had appeared from the forest. Rows of wooden pews, some overturned but most still in orderly lines, faced toward an altar where a simple wooden cross hung above a stone table. Faded frescoes decorated the walls, saints and angels, whose faces had been softened by time until they seemed more like gentle suggestions than specific figures. Winter light filtered through tall windows, whose glass had somehow survived whatever had claimed the rest of the village this chapel had once served. "It's beautiful," Mira whispered, her voice carrying in the hushed space. Elena had to agree. There was something peaceful about the abandoned chapel, something that felt safer than any place they had known since their parents died. Even empty and cold, it retained an atmosphere of sanctuary that went deeper than its religious purpose. Aldric moved through the space with practiced efficiency, checking the windows for broken glass, examining the walls for structural damage. He seemed to know what to look for, as if he had sheltered in many abandoned buildings over the years. When he was satisfied with his inspection, he knelt near the altar and began building a fire in what had once been a brazier. Elena watched him work and noticed things that struck her as odd. His movements were too precise, too economical, like a man accustomed to making camp in hostile territory. When he struck flint to tinder, the spark caught immediately, as if the fire obeyed him rather than the normal laws of combustion. And despite the bitter cold that had Elena and Mira huddled together for warmth, Aldric showed no signs of discomfort. He didn't blow on his hands or stamp his feet or any of the small things people did when winter bit deep. "Are you a soldier?" Mira asked as flames began to dance in the brazier. The warmth spread quickly through the stone chamber, faster than seemed natural for so small a fire. Aldric paused in arranging kindling. "I have been, among other things." "What other things?" Elena found herself curious, despite her caution. Their rescuer was clearly no ordinary traveller, but she couldn't place him in any category she knew. Too well dressed for a mercenary, too comfortable with hardship for a soft merchant, too alone for a noble with proper retainers. "I've been many things over the years," Aldric said, settling back on his heels as the fire established itself. "Tonight, I'm simply someone who couldn't leave two young women to freeze on a forest road." He opened his pack and began removing items: bread wrapped in oiled cloth, dried meat, a small pot for melting snow into water. Elena's stomach clenched at the smell of real food, the kind they hadn't tasted in weeks. "We can't pay you for this," she said quietly. "I'm not selling it." Mira moved closer to the fire, holding her hands out to catch the warmth. "Will you eat with us?" Another pause, barely perceptible but somehow significant. "I've already eaten today, but please, share what you need." Elena unwrapped the bread with reverent care. It was fresh, or nearly so, with a firm crust that spoke of a proper oven and skilled hands. Where had he found such bread in the middle of winter, on roads where they had seen no other travellers? "Where are you travelling from?" she asked, tearing the loaf carefully into 3 equal portions. "The north," Aldric replied, which again wasn't quite an answer. "I've been visiting old places, settling old business." "And where are you going?" This time the pause was longer. Aldric stared into the fire with those strange grey eyes, as if he could see something in the flames that wasn't visible to others. "I'm not certain," he said finally. "I thought I was seeking solitude, but perhaps I was seeking something else without knowing it." Elena handed a portion of bread to Mira and kept one for herself, placing the third piece on the stone floor near Aldric. He looked at it, but made no move to take it. "You should eat," Mira said gently. "You've shared everything else with us." "I'm not hungry." The way he said it carried a finality that discouraged further offers, but Elena filed the observation away with all the other oddities about their mysterious benefactor. As they ate slowly, savouring every bite, Elena studied Aldric in the firelight. His face was striking enough to belong to a statue in some grand cathedral, but there was something unsettling about its perfection. No scars, though he moved like a fighting man. No weathering, though he claimed to be a traveller. And those eyes held depths that seemed older than his apparent years. "How long has this chapel been abandoned?" Mira asked, looking around at the faded frescoes. "Several years," Aldric said. "The village it served was taken by plague, like so many others. But you've been here before." "Yes." Elena waited for elaboration that didn't come. Their rescuer seemed comfortable with silence in a way that suggested either noble breeding or extensive solitude. She found herself wanting to fill the quiet spaces with questions, but something about his manner discouraged casual conversation. "The cross," she said instead, nodding toward the altar. "It's older than the rest." Aldric followed her gaze. The wooden cross was indeed ancient, its carved surface worn smooth by countless hands and countless prayers. It seemed to be the heart of the chapel, the one element that had been carefully preserved while everything else aged naturally. "It's been here longer than the building," he agreed. This was a sacred site long before Christians claimed it. The cross was added later, but the sanctity that's older than any particular faith. Elena found his phrasing curious. Most people would have said, "our faith," or "the true faith." Aldrich spoke of Christianity as if it were something external to him, something he observed rather than practiced. "You're not a believer?" she asked. "I believe in many things. Mercy, for instance. Redemption, though I'm less certain of that one." He looked directly at her. and Elena felt the weight of his attention like a physical force. I believe that sometimes the most important choice we make is what we don't do. Mira had been listening quietly, but now she spoke up. Tonight, I chose not to ride past two desperate women on a dangerous road. I chose not to take advantage of their desperation, despite the invitation. His voice was gentle, but carried an undercurrent of something Elena couldn't identify. Sometimes our humanity is defined less by what we do than by what we refuse to do. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Elena found herself thinking about choices, the choice to leave Ravenshollow, the choice to approach a stranger on the road, the choice to offer themselves in marriage to a man they didn't know. At each point, they could have chosen differently. They could have stayed and starved, or hidden in the forest, or simply begged for charity. "Why did you choose to help us?" she asked. Aldric was quiet for so long that Elena wondered if he would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because once, a very long time ago, someone showed mercy to me when I deserved none. I've spent years trying to understand why." He met her eyes again. "Tonight, I think I'm beginning to remember what it feels like to be human." As the fire settled into steady warmth, Elena noticed how the chapel transformed in the flickering light. The faded frescoes seemed to come alive, their gentle faces watching over the small group with patient kindness. Snow continued to fall outside the tall windows, but within these ancient walls she felt safer than she had in months. Mira had drawn closer to the fire, and Elena saw her sister reach into her bodice to pull out a small object wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing not just their mother's ring, but something else, a tiny wooden doll, crudely carved but lovingly polished, smooth by countless small hands. "You still have that?" Elena asked softly. "I couldn't leave her behind." Mira held the doll up to catch the firelight. "Father made her for me when I was 7. Do you remember? I had been crying because the merchant's daughter had a beautiful doll from the capital, and we couldn't afford anything like it." Elena did remember. Their father had worked for 3 evenings by candlelight, carving the little figure from a piece of apple wood. It wasn't as fine as a purchased toy, but it had been made with love, and Mira had treasured it. "I thought you'd outgrown dolls," Elena said, though her voice held no judgment. "I had, but when everything else was gone." Mira's voice caught slightly. "She's all I have left of him. Of the time when we were children and safe, and the world made sense." Aldric had been arranging supplies from his pack, but Elena noticed his hands still when Mira spoke. When she looked at his face, she saw an expression of such profound sadness that it took her breath away. It was the look of someone who understood exactly what it meant to hold on to fragments of a lost world. "What was your father's trade?" he asked gently. "He was a carpenter," Mira replied, cradling the doll. "Not just furniture, he could carve anything. Birds that looked ready to fly, flowers that seemed to have scent. Mother used to say his hands held magic." "And what did you call her?" Aldric nodded toward the doll. "Rosalie. After the wild roses that grew by our kitchen window." Mira looked up at him with curious eyes. "You don't think it's foolish, do you? A grown woman carrying a child's toy?" "I think," Aldric said slowly, "that holding on to love in any form requires tremendous courage. The world tries to strip away everything that makes us human. Those who manage to keep something, anything, of who they were before the stripping began are the strongest people I know." Elena studied their mysterious protector. His words carried the weight of experience, as if he had lost many precious things himself. She wondered what he might have carried with him through his travels, what remnants of his own past he preserved against the world's casual cruelty. "Do you have anything like that?" she asked. "Something from before." Aldric was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "I have memories," he said finally. "Sometimes I wonder if that's enough, or if it's too much." "Too much? There are things I remember that I wish I could forget, and things I've forgotten that I desperately wish I could remember. He looked at Mira, still holding her wooden doll. Your Rosalie there, she represents the good memories, doesn't she? The love and safety and innocence. Mira nodded. When I hold her, I can almost hear Father humming while he worked. Almost smell Mother's bread baking. Then she's more valuable than any treasure. Aldric's voice held a note of what might have been envy. I would trade much for such simple, pure memories. Elena found herself drawn into the conversation, despite her usual caution around strangers. What do you remember instead? War, mostly. Death. The sound of steel on steel, the smell of blood and fear. Aldric pulled off his leather gloves and held his hands out to the fire. Elena noticed they were unmarked, no scars, no calluses, nothing to suggest the hard use he spoke of. I remember being very young and thinking the world was a place where good people prospered and evil was punished. I remember the day I learned how wrong that was. How young? Mira asked. Another pause. Longer this time. Younger than you are now. Elena wanted to ask more, but something in Aldric's manner suggested he had already shared more than he intended. Instead, she found herself talking about her own memories, not the recent horror of plague and war, but older things. Summer festivals in Ravenshollow, when the whole village would gather in the square. Her mother teaching her to braid herbs for the harvest celebration. Her father letting her help in his workshop, showing her how to read the grain of wood to find the shape that wanted to emerge. You were happy there, Aldric observed. It wasn't a question. We were. For 19 years, we were very happy. Elena looked around the chapel, thinking of all the happy families who had once worshipped here, all the children who had been baptized at that altar, all the couples who had spoken their vows beneath that ancient cross. It's strange how quickly happiness can disappear. How completely. It's even stranger how unexpectedly it can return, Aldric said quietly. I had forgotten that. Something in his voice made Elena look at him more carefully. In the firelight, his perfect features seemed less marble-like, more human. For a moment, she caught a glimpse of something beneath the polished surface, a loneliness so profound it made her own losses seem small by comparison. When did you last feel happy? Mira asked, with the directness of youth. Aldric considered the question seriously. I'm not certain I remember. It's been a very long time. Then why do you travel alone? Elena found herself asking. Surely there are people who would welcome your company. You're clearly a gentleman, well-educated, prosperous. I travel alone because I've forgotten how to be anything else. Aldric looked at both sisters, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight. Until tonight, I thought that was how I preferred it. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the chapel windows and sending occasional puffs of snow through gaps in the old stone. But inside, the warmth held steady. Elena realized that for the first time since her parents died, she felt truly safe. Not just physically protected, but emotionally sheltered in a way she hadn't even known she'd been missing. Will you stay with us tonight? Mira asked. I know you said the chapel was safe, but you'd feel safer if I remained. Aldric nodded, understanding. Yes, I'll stay. Though I should warn you, I don't sleep much. I tend to keep watch. Elena wanted to ask why a man traveling alone would need to keep watch in an abandoned chapel in the middle of nowhere. But the day had been long and overwhelming, and the warmth of the fire was making her drowsy. Some questions could wait for tomorrow. Thank you, she said simply, for everything. Aldric's response was so quiet she almost missed it. Thank you for reminding me that mercy is still possible. I had begun to think I'd lost the capacity for it. Elena woke to the pale grey light of winter dawn filtering through the chapel windows. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. The sensation of warmth and safety was so foreign after weeks of cold fear that her mind struggled to accept it. Then she saw Mira sleeping peacefully beside her, still clutching her wooden doll, and memory returned. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, but the chapel retained its warmth in a way that seemed almost magical. Elena sat up carefully, not wanting to wake her sister, and looked around for their mysterious benefactor. Aldric was gone. Elena's heart lurched with sudden panic. Had he abandoned them? Had something driven him away in the night? She rose quickly and moved to the chapel door, pushing it open to peer into the morning forest. The world outside had been transformed by the night's snowfall. Everything lay beneath a fresh blanket of white that sparkled in the early sunlight. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline silence that seemed to ring in Elena's ears. "Looking for me?" Elena spun around to find Aldric emerging from the trees behind the chapel. He carried an armload of dry wood and moved with the same silent grace she had noticed the day before. In daylight, she could see more details of his appearance, the expensive fabric of his clothes, the silver threading in his dark hair, the way he moved like a man accustomed to command. "I thought you had left," she said, relief evident in her voice. "I promised I would stay. I don't break my promises." He approached the chapel, and Elena noticed he seemed to hesitate before crossing the threshold. When he did enter, it was with careful, deliberate steps, as if the sacred space required special consideration. "Where did you find dry wood after all that snow?" "I know how to look for what I need." Aldric began rebuilding the fire with practiced efficiency. "Your sister is still sleeping?" "Yes. She hasn't slept so peacefully in months." Elena watched him work, noting again the oddities in his behavior. He moved through the chapel as if he were trying not to disturb something, though the place had been abandoned for years. "You said you don't sleep much. Did you rest at all?" "I'm accustomed to little sleep, and someone needed to keep watch." "Watch for what? We're in the middle of nowhere." Aldric paused in his fire building to look at her directly. "You're two young women traveling alone in winter, carrying what little wealth you have left. There are many things worth watching for." As if summoned by his words, they heard the distant sound of horses. Multiple horses, moving fast along the forest road. Elena's blood went cold as the sounds grew closer, armed men, by the jingle of metal and leather that carried through the crisp air. "Get behind the altar," Aldric said quietly, his entire demeanor changing. "Wake your sister, but keep her quiet." Elena didn't argue. She shook Mira awake and quickly explained the situation in whispers. The two sisters crept behind the stone altar, pressing themselves against the wall where they would be hidden from anyone entering through the main door. The horsemen stopped outside the chapel. Elena could hear voices, though not the words. Then footsteps approached the door, and she held her breath. "Ho there!" a rough voice called out. "Anyone shelter here last night?" Elena heard Aldric's voice respond, but it sounded different somehow, commanding, with an undertone that made her skin prickle. "I am here alone, resting my horse. What brings armed men to sacred ground? We seek 2 women, refugees from the burned villages, young ones traveling together." The speaker had entered the chapel now, his spurs ringing against the stone floor. "They're wanted for questioning by Baron Corvus." Elena's heart nearly stopped. Baron Corvus, the same nobleman whose soldiers had destroyed their village. Why would he be hunting them specifically? "I have seen no women on these roads," Aldric replied, his voice carrying strange authority. "Perhaps you should look elsewhere." "Aye, perhaps we should." The soldier's voice had taken on an odd, dreamy quality. "Strange, though we found tracks in the snow, leading to this very place." Elena risked a glance around the edge of the altar and saw something that made no sense. 3 armed soldiers stood in the chapel, but they were looking directly at Aldric without seeming to see him clearly. Their eyes had a glazed quality, as if they were looking through thick water. "Tracks can be misleading in snow," Aldric said conversationally. "Wind and animals can create many false signs. I'm certain you'll find what you're looking for elsewhere." "Elsewhere," the lead soldier repeated slowly. "Aye, we should look elsewhere." The men turned and walked out of the chapel without another word, their movements stiff and unnatural. Elena heard them mount their horses and ride away, but she remained frozen behind the altar until the sounds faded completely. "They're gone," Aldric said softly. "You can come out." Elena and Mira emerged from their hiding place, both pale with fear and confusion. "What just happened?" Elena demanded. "They were looking right at you, but they—" "Sometimes people see what they expect to see, rather than what's actually there," Aldric replied, which wasn't really an answer. "But how did—" "The important question," Aldric interrupted gently, "is why Baron Corvus is specifically hunting for you. You said his soldiers burned your village, but why would he send men to track down two particular survivors?" Elena and Mira exchanged glances. They had wondered the same thing but had no answers. "We don't know," Mira said in a small voice. "We lost everything when his men came through. We hid until they left." "Think," Aldric urged. "Was there anything unusual about your family? Any reason the Baron might want to find you specifically?" Elena searched her memory, trying to find some significance in their ordinary lives. Their father had been a carpenter, their mother a healer who knew herb lore. They had lived quietly, bothering no one, drawing no special attention. "Mother," she said suddenly. "Mother kept the village records." Aldric's grey eyes sharpened with interest. "What kind of records?" "Births, deaths, marriages, tax assessments." She could read and write, so the village council appointed her to keep the books. Elena felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to fit together. When the plague came, she was still updating the death rolls right up until she got sick herself. "And these records," Aldric said carefully, "what happened to them when your parents died?" Elena felt cold despite the fire's warmth. "We brought them with us. They're in our bundle. We thought they might be important somehow, official documents that proved we were who we said we were." Aldric closed his eyes briefly. "Show me these records." With trembling hands, Elena retrieved their small bundle and unwrapped the precious documents her mother had maintained. As Aldric examined the careful notations of village life and death, his expression grew increasingly grim. "These numbers," he said finally, "they show that your village lost far fewer people to plague than was reported to the Baron's tax collectors." "What does that mean?" "It means Baron Corvus has been claiming tax exemptions for dead villagers who were actually alive. It means you're carrying evidence of fraud that could cost him his lands and title." Aldric looked up at both sisters with something approaching urgency. "It means you're far more dangerous to him than you ever imagined." The revelation hung in the air between them like smoke from the chapel fire. Elena stared at the documents in Aldric's hands, pages that had seemed like simple family keepsakes, now transformed into instruments of deadly political significance. "My mother never said anything about fraud," Mira whispered. "She just kept the records because someone had to." "Your mother probably never knew," Aldric replied, his voice gentle despite the gravity of their situation. "She recorded what she saw: births, deaths, the truth of your village's population. The Baron's clerks would have reported different numbers to the Crown, claiming tax relief for villages decimated by plague while secretly collecting from survivors." Elena felt a familiar surge of the protective anger that had kept her alive through the worst months. "He burned our village anyway, killed the people he was stealing from. Why does he still need to hunt us?" "Because fraudulent tax records are treason. If these documents reached the king's auditors, Baron Corvus would face execution." Aldric carefully rolled the papers and handed them back to Elena. "Dead men don't pay taxes, but they also don't give testimony. You two are living proof that his reports were lies." The chapel suddenly felt less like sanctuary and more like a trap. Elena moved to the windows, peering out at the peaceful forest that now seemed full of hidden threats. "How many men do you think he'll send?" "All of them. Eventually." Aldric began pacing the length of the chapel, his movements predatory and restless. "He can't afford to let you live, and he knows these roads well. We need to move, and soon. To where? Mira asked, still clutching her wooden doll like a talisman against the harsh realities crushing down around them. If he has men everywhere, not everywhere, his authority has limits. Aldric stopped pacing and looked directly at both sisters. There are free territories beyond the mountain passes, places where the king's law runs stronger than any local baron's reach. Elena felt her heart sink. The mountains? In winter? That's suicide. Staying here is suicide, Aldric replied matter-of-factly. At least the mountains offer a chance. A new sound reached them from outside, the distant jingling of harness and armor, but different from the patrol that had passed earlier. This sound was larger, more organized. Elena's blood chilled as she recognized the organized rhythm of a full company of soldiers moving in formation. "They're coming back," she breathed. Aldric was already in motion, gathering supplies with inhuman speed. Not the same group. Listen to the cadence. These are the Baron's household guard, not random patrols. Someone reported our presence here. But those soldiers you sent away, they seemed convinced we weren't here. Compulsion doesn't last forever, especially on trained men. Aldric's casual mention of magic made Elena's head spin, but there was no time to process the implications. Get your things. We have perhaps 10 minutes before they surround this place. Elena stuffed the precious documents back into their bundle, while Mira quickly wrapped her doll in its protective cloth. The sounds outside were getting closer. Elena could now distinguish individual voices, the snorts of horses being held in check, the deliberate movements of men forming a perimeter. "There's a back entrance through the vestry," Aldric said, leading them toward a small door behind the altar that Elena hadn't noticed before. "It leads to the old cemetery. From there we can reach the forest without being seen." They slipped through the narrow door into a smaller chamber where ancient vestments still hung from wooden pegs like ghostly witnesses. Beyond another door lay the cemetery. Aldric had mentioned a small plot behind the chapel where weathered headstones poked through the snow like broken teeth. "Stay low and follow my steps exactly," Aldric whispered. "The snow will show our tracks, but I can blur them for a short time." Elena didn't understand what he meant until they began moving. Somehow, their footprints in the snow seemed to fill themselves almost as soon as they made them, as if the wind was following them specifically to erase evidence of their passage. She wanted to ask about this impossible phenomenon, but the proximity of their pursuers demanded silence. They reached the tree line just as Elena heard the chapel door crash open behind them. Male voices echoed through the sacred space, harsh with frustrated authority. Someone was giving orders in the clipped tones of military command. "Search everything. Check the altar, the vestry. Look for any sign they were here. Sir, there are cold ashes in the brazier. Someone had a fire recently. Then they were here. Fan out, check the cemetery, the forest edge. They can't have gone far on foot." Aldric led them deeper into the woods, moving with impossible silence through undergrowth that should have crackled and snapped under their feet. Elena found herself following a man who seemed to bend the natural world to his will, leaving no trace, making no sound, moving through winter forest as if he were part of the landscape itself. "What are you?" she whispered when they paused behind a massive oak trunk. Aldric glanced back at her, and in the filtered daylight she saw his grey eyes held flecks of silver that seemed to move independently of the iris. Someone who's lived long enough to learn skills your enemies don't expect. It wasn't an answer, but it would have to suffice. Behind them, Elena could hear soldiers spreading through the cemetery, their search growing more systematic and determined. Soon they would find the footprints, erased or not, and the hunt would truly begin. "How far to these mountain passes?" Mira asked, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. 2 days hard travel," Aldric replied, "through terrain that will test your endurance even without pursuit." Elena looked at her sister, 17 years old, weakened by months of poor food and constant stress, carrying a childhood toy like armor against the world's cruelty. Then she looked at herself, hardly stronger despite being older, burdened with documents that had made them targets of a powerful man's lethal attention. "We'll do it," she said firmly. "Whatever it takes." Aldric studied her with those strange, shifting eyes. "It will require more strength than you know you possess." "Then we'll find that strength." Elena pulled her sister closer. "We've survived this long. We'll survive whatever comes next." Something flickered across Aldric's perfect features, surprise perhaps, or admiration. "Yes," he said quietly. "I believe you will." Behind them a soldier shouted, "Tracks here, leading toward the forest." Aldric's expression hardened. "Time to discover exactly how much strength you can find." He turned and began moving deeper into the woods, leading two young women toward mountains that promised either freedom or death, while behind them the sound of pursuit grew steadily closer. They had been traveling through the forest for 3 hours when disaster struck in the most ordinary of ways. Elena, exhausted from the constant tension and the grueling pace Aldric set through the trackless woods, stumbled over a hidden route. As she fell forward, her hand instinctively reached out to break her fall, and her fingers caught the chain around her neck. The silver locket, her grandmother's locket, the one piece of jewelry their mother had insisted she wear always for protection, snapped free and went flying through the air. Aldric, who had been leading them with inhuman grace through the dense undergrowth, turned at the sound of Elena's fall and instinctively reached out to catch the tumbling piece of silver. The moment the locket touched his palm, his flesh began to smoke. Elena watched in horror as Aldric's hand burst into flames where the silver contacted his skin. He didn't cry out, but his face contorted in agony as he dropped the locket into the snow, where it hissed and steamed like a coal dropped into water. "What?" Mira started to speak, but her words died as they both stared at Aldric's burned hand. The flesh was black and blistered, but even as they watched, it began to heal. Not slowly, as human wounds healed, but visibly, moment by moment, until unmarked skin replaced the burned tissue. Aldric looked up at both sisters, his grey eyes holding 8 centuries of weary resignation. "Now you know." Elena's mind reeled. Silver burned him. He healed from wounds that should have taken months to recover from. He moved without sound, convinced trained soldiers to ignore obvious evidence, and traveled alone through winter as if cold meant nothing to him. "You're a vampire," she whispered. "Yes." The simple confirmation hit Elena like a physical blow. Every story she had ever heard about the undead came flooding back, creatures that fed on blood, that commanded unnatural strength, that could entrance human minds and walked in darkness. Monsters from children's nightmares, except this one had spent 2 days protecting them with gentle kindness. For how long? Elena found herself asking, though part of her mind screamed that she should be running, not asking questions. 800 years, give or take a decade. Aldric flexed his newly healed hand, studying their faces. "I was turned during the Crusades by a creature who thought she was saving me from death. Perhaps she was. I've had a long time to consider the question." Mira had gone very still, her wooden doll pressed against her chest like a shield. Do you drink blood?" "Yes." Elena felt the world shift around her, as if everything she thought she knew about their situation had been built on lies. "Whose blood?" "Not yours, if that's what you're asking." Aldric's voice was patient, almost gentle. "I learned long ago to hunt only those who deserve hunting. Murderers, rapists, men who prey on the innocent. There's always enough evil in the world to sustain me without adding to it." "But you could," Elena pressed. "You could drink from us. You could have, at any time since we met." "Yes." The honesty was somehow more terrifying than any lie would have been. Elena stared at the man, the creature who had shown them nothing but mercy, trying to reconcile the reality of what he was with the gentleness he had displayed. "Why didn't you?" Mira asked in a small voice. Aldric was quiet for a long moment, looking down at his hands. When he spoke, His voice carried the weight of centuries of loneliness and regret. "Because 6 months ago I fed from a man I thought was a bandit attacking travelers on a lonely road. After he died, I discovered he had been a father of 3, desperate enough to risk robbery because his children were starving, his wife was dying of fever, and he had no money for medicine." Elena saw something break in Aldric's perfect features, a glimpse of the guilt that had been eating at him. "I killed a man who was trying to save his family, a man who was, perhaps, not so different from your father, might have been in desperate circumstances." Aldric looked directly at both sisters. "I swore that night that I would never again take life from someone who didn't deserve to lose it. But hunger doesn't care about oaths. For 6 months, I've been slowly starving myself because I couldn't find anyone evil enough to justify killing. That's why you were traveling alone," Elena realized. "You were looking for a place to die without hurting anyone else." "Yes." Aldric's smile was bitter. "Instead, I found 2 young women begging a stranger to be their husband, and I remembered what it felt like to protect something innocent instead of destroying it." Elena's mind was spinning. Everything about their encounter took on new meaning. Aldric's hesitation when they first approached him, his refusal to eat with them, his supernatural abilities that had kept them safe. He had been protecting them while slowly dying from starvation. "You've been hungry this whole time," she said, "while you were helping us. Hunger is easier to bear than the alternative." Mira spoke up suddenly, her young voice clear and determined. "You saved us. I helped you temporarily. The Baron's men are still hunting you." "No," Mira said firmly. "You saved us. When we were kneeling in that snow, we were already dead. We just didn't know it yet. You gave us hope again. You gave us each other back. Elena stopped trying to carry everything alone, and I stopped pretending everything would be fine." Elena looked at her sister with new respect. Mira was right. Whatever Aldric was, whatever he had done in his long existence, he had chosen to protect them when he could have simply ridden past. He had suffered hunger to keep them safe. "The stories," Elena said slowly, "about vampires. They say you can't enter sacred ground. I can enter. It's uncomfortable, like trying to breathe underwater. But I can do it when the cause is worthy." "And you can't bear sunlight?" "Direct sunlight is painful, sometimes lethal. I travel at night when possible, shelter during the brightest hours." Elena remembered waking in the chapel to find Aldric absent, remembered how he had emerged from the forest with wood. He had spent the daylight hours outside, in discomfort or pain, gathering fuel to keep them warm. "You've been protecting us at cost to yourself," she realized. "Everything worthwhile comes at cost." Elena looked at Mira, seeing her own thoughts reflected in her sister's eyes. They stood at a crossroads that would define not just their survival, but who they chose to be, in a world where moral absolutes had proven to be illusions. "We still need to reach the mountains," Mira said quietly. "You do," Aldric agreed, "but now you know what your protector truly is. If you wish to continue alone—" "No." Elena's voice was steady, certain. "You've had 800 years to become a monster, and instead you chose to starve yourself rather than harm innocents. You've protected us when you could have used us. Whatever you are, whatever you've done, I trust your actions more than your nature." Mira nodded agreement. "Besides," she added with a small smile, "we offered to marry you before we knew you were a vampire. Seems foolish to withdraw the offer now that you've proven you're trustworthy." Aldric stared at them both, and Elena saw something she hadn't expected in his ancient eyes' tears. "I don't deserve such faith." "Maybe not," Elena said, retrieving her grandmother's locket from the snow and carefully wrapping it in cloth. "But you have it anyway." Behind them, the distant sound of pursuing soldiers grew louder. Baron Corvus's men were closing the distance, following their trail through the winter forest. "We should move," Aldric said, his voice rough with emotion. "The mountains are still 2 days away, and now you're traveling with a creature that half the world would kill on sight." Elena shouldered their small bundle of possessions and helped Mira to her feet. Then we'd better make sure the world doesn't get the chance. As they resumed their desperate flight through the forest, Elena realized that everything had changed, and somehow everything remained the same. They were still three souls seeking salvation in a world that offered none. The only difference was that now they faced that world with complete honesty about who and what they were. It would have to be enough. The mountain pass appeared before them like a gateway to another world. After 2 days of relentless flight through increasingly treacherous terrain, the ancient trail carved into the mountainside seemed both salvation and death trap. Snow-laden peaks rose on either side, their slopes so steep that avalanches were an ever-present threat. The path itself was barely wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast, with a sheer drop into darkness on the left side and towering rock walls on the right. Elena pulled the ancient map from their bundle, the parchment crackling in the cold air. The document was centuries old, drawn by some long-dead cartographer who had marked the treacherous route with careful notations. Beware rockfall, wind devils, eagle's roost, last shelter before the high pass. According to this, we're still half a day from the summit, she said, studying the faded ink markings. But look at these warnings. Aldric examined the map over her shoulder, his enhanced senses reading details that would be invisible to human eyes, even in good light. This was drawn during the reign of King Marcus II. These passes have grown more dangerous since then. Climate changes, erosion, earthquake damage. You knew King Marcus? Mira asked, still finding it difficult to grasp the span of Aldric's existence. I fought in his border wars against the northern clans, a good king, as kings go. He understood that some victories cost more than defeats. Aldric pointed to a marking on the map near the summit. This shelter here, Eagle's Roost. If it still stands, we could rest there before making the final ascent. Elena folded the map carefully. Behind them, Baron Corvus's pursuit had been relentless. They had gained ground during the night hours, when Aldric's supernatural abilities gave them advantage, but during the day their pace slowed as he struggled with the mountain sunlight, reflecting off snow and ice. "How much farther behind us are they?" Mira asked. 6 hours, perhaps 8. Aldric's hearing could detect sounds far beyond human range. The Baron himself is with them now. I can hear his voice when the wind is right. Elena felt cold that had nothing to do with the mountain air. He's coming himself? These documents represent his life or death. He can't delegate this hunt to subordinates. Aldric looked up at the treacherous path ahead, which means he'll take risks that trained soldiers might avoid. They had been climbing for 3 hours when they encountered the first of the mountain pass's deadly features, a section where the path narrowed to less than 3 feet wide, with loose scree that shifted dangerously underfoot. One wrong step would send a climber tumbling into the abyss below. "Stay close to the rock wall," Aldric instructed, demonstrating how to press against the stone while moving sideways along the narrow ledge. "Don't look down, and test each foothold before putting your full weight on it." Elena went first, her heart hammering as she inched along the precipice. Halfway across, a stone broke loose under her foot and went clattering into the darkness below. She pressed herself against the cold rock, fighting down panic, until Aldric's steady voice guided her forward. "That's it. 2 more steps. You're almost across." When they finally reached safer ground, Elena's legs were shaking so badly she had to sit down. Mira collapsed beside her, pale but determined. "If we're having trouble with this," Elena gasped. "Won't the Baron's men?" "The Baron has mountain guides," Aldric said grimly. "Men who know these passes. Our advantage is that we're lighter, more agile. But they have experience." As if summoned by his words, they heard the distant echo of voices from far below. The pursuit had reached the base of the mountain trail. "We need to keep moving," Aldric said. "The higher we get before they start climbing, the better our chances." The afternoon sun reflecting off snow and ice was clearly affecting Aldric. Elena noticed him squinting against the glare, moving more carefully than usual. When they paused to rest near a wind-carved overhang, she saw that his exposed skin had taken on a reddish tinge, like a severe sunburn. "You're in pain," she observed. "I've endured worse." But Elena could see the cost in his careful movements, the way he sought whatever shade was available. "There," Mira said suddenly, pointing ahead. "Is that the shelter?" Eagle's Roost perched on a narrow ledge like a stone bird frozen mid-flight. The ancient structure was smaller than Elena had hoped, barely large enough for 3 people, but its thick stone walls had weathered centuries of mountain storms. More importantly, it would provide shelter from the sun and wind. Inside, the refuge was spartanly furnished, stone benches built into the walls, rings for securing climbing ropes, and most crucially, a cache of emergency supplies left by previous travelers. Elena found dried meat, hard biscuits, and a small cask of wine that hadn't frozen solid. "Mountain courtesy," Aldric explained, noting her surprised expression. "Travelers leave supplies for those who come after. It's saved countless lives over the centuries." Elena shared the food with Mira, while Aldric rested in the deepest shadows, his supernatural constitution finally showing the strain of their journey. In the stone shelter, away from the reflected sunlight, his pale skin began to lose its burned appearance. "How much farther to the summit?" Mira asked, looking out at the treacherous path that wound upward into mist and cloud. Aldric consulted the ancient map. 3 hours of hard climbing. "But there's something else. Look at this marking." Elena studied where his finger pointed. Near the summit, someone had drawn a small symbol that looked like a horn, with notations in an archaic script. "What does it say?" "It's a warning about avalanche zones. This symbol marks the location of an ancient warning horn, a device the mountain clans used to communicate across the peaks. But it also notes that sounding the horn near the summit can trigger avalanches in the steep ravines below." Elena felt pieces of a desperate plan beginning to form in her mind. Could that stop the Baron's men? It could stop anyone in the ravine below when the horn sounds. But Elena, Aldric's voice, carried a note of warning. "Avalanches don't discriminate. If we're anywhere in the zone of effect. But if we're above it? On the far side of the summit? Runes." Aldric studied the map more carefully. "Possibly. The ancient clans used this tactic against invading armies. But the timing would have to be perfect, and someone would have to stay behind to sound the horn." "I'll do it," Elena said immediately. "No." Mira's voice was firm. "I'm smaller, lighter. I can move faster over the difficult sections." "Absolutely not. I'm the elder sister, and I'm tired of being protected." Mira's eyes flashed with determination Elena had never seen before. "You've carried everything since Mother and Father died. You've made every hard choice, taken every risk. This time, let me be the one who saves us." Aldric listened to their argument with growing concern. "There may be another way." "No," Elena said, studying the map. "This is our best chance. Maybe our only chance. The Baron has more men, better equipment, guides who know these mountains. But he doesn't have this." She touched the ancient parchment. "He doesn't know about the horn." Outside their stone refuge, the voices of their pursuers grew closer. Baron Corvus's men had made better time up the mountain than expected. Elena realized they had perhaps 2 hours before the hunters reached their position. "We need to decide now," Aldric said quietly. "Once we leave this shelter, we're committed to whatever plan we choose." Elena looked at her sister, 17 years old, clutching her wooden doll, but with steel in her blue eyes that reminded Elena of their mother's determination. Then she looked at Aldric, whose 8 centuries of experience had led him to this moment of choosing protection over survival. "We go to the summit together," Elena decided, "all 3 of us. When we sight the Baron's men in the avalanche zone, one of us sounds the horn. We'll decide who when the moment comes." "Elena," Mira started to protest. "No arguments. We started this journey together, and we'll finish it together. Elena stood and shouldered their bundle. Whatever happens next, we face it as a family. Aldric rose from the shadows, his supernatural strength returning as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. Then let's climb. They left Eagle's Roost as the afternoon light began to fade. 3 figures silhouetted against the vast sky, climbing toward a summit that promised either freedom or death. Behind them, Baron Corvus's voice echoed off the mountain walls, driving his men upward with promises of gold and threats of execution. The avalanche horn waited somewhere in the mists above, an ancient device that would soon determine the fate of everyone on the mountain. Elena climbed toward it with steady determination, knowing that before the sun set, she would discover exactly how much courage she possessed when everything she loved hung in the balance. The mountain waited, patient and indifferent, ready to be either salvation or tomb. The avalanche horn stood exactly where the ancient map had promised, carved from a massive curve of mountain sheep horn and mounted on a stone platform near the summit. Centuries of wind and weather had darkened it to the color of old bone, but the carved symbols along its length still showed clearly warnings and blessings in the forgotten language of the mountain clans. Elena approached it with reverence, understanding that this simple device represented the accumulated wisdom of people who had learned to survive in one of the world's most hostile environments. The horn was larger than she had expected, nearly 4 feet long and requiring considerable breath to sound properly. "The acoustics are perfect here," Aldric observed, his enhanced hearing picking up subtle echoes from the surrounding peaks. "One sustained blast will carry to every ravine and slope within miles." Mira peered over the edge of the summit, looking down at the treacherous path they had just climbed. "I can see them," she said quietly. "Still about an hour behind us, but moving faster now." Elena followed her sister's gaze and spotted the line of dark figures making their way up the mountain face. Baron Corvus's men moved with the efficiency of professional soldiers, but they were strung out along the narrow trail, perfect targets for an avalanche if the timing was right. "How long do we have?" she asked Aldric. "Once they enter the danger zone, perhaps 20 minutes before they reach positions where an avalanche couldn't touch them." Aldric studied the approaching hunters with predatory focus. "The Baron is pushing them hard. He knows this is his last chance before we cross into free territory." Elena tested the weight of the horn, lifting it to gauge how much strength would be required to produce a proper blast. The ancient instrument was heavier than it looked, carved from solid horn and reinforced with bronze fittings that spoke of master craftsmanship. "Elena," Mira's voice was steady, resolved. "Let me do this. You know it makes sense. I'm the fastest, the most agile. I can get away from the horn position quicker than either of you." "No." Elena's response was immediate and final. "We've already discussed this. But look at the terrain." Mira pointed to the steep slopes surrounding the horn platform. "After it sounds, whoever stays has to get clear of the avalanche zone in minutes. I'm the only one light enough and quick enough to—" "I said no, Mira." Aldric had been listening to their argument while tracking the progress of their pursuers. Now he spoke with quiet authority. "There's something else to consider. The horn requires tremendous lung capacity to sound properly. I can produce the volume needed without risking failure." Elena looked at him sharply. "And then what? You're fast, but not fast enough to outrun an avalanche. And the sun is setting. In another hour, I'll have my full strength back." Aldric's grey eyes met hers. "I can sound the horn and escape. You two can be safely across the summit before the avalanche even begins." "Absolutely not." Elena's voice carried the same steel that had kept her and Mira alive through months of desperate survival. "We're not sacrificing anyone. We find another way." Below them, Baron Corvus's voice echoed off the mountain walls as he drove his men upward with increasing urgency. Elena could make out individual figures, now armed soldiers in winter gear, climbing with grim determination toward the summit where their quarry waited. "They're entering the avalanche zone," Aldric reported, his supernatural senses tracking their exact positions. "In 15 minutes, they'll be perfectly positioned." Elena hefted the ancient horn again, feeling its weight and balance. An idea was forming, desperate, dangerous, but possible. "What if we don't wait?" she said suddenly. "What if we trigger the avalanche now, while they're still in the lower reaches?" "The timing would be wrong," Aldric replied. "Too early, and they can retreat to safety. Too late, and they'll be above the danger zone. But what if we're not trying to bury them?" Elena's mind raced through possibilities. "What if we're just trying to block the path behind them, trap them on this side of the mountain until we can escape?" Mira caught on immediately. "Cut off their retreat, force them to continue climbing into territory where we have the advantage." Aldric considered the strategy. Risky. If the avalanche is larger than expected— "Everything about this is risky," Elena interrupted. "But it gives us the best chance of all three of us surviving." She moved to the horn platform and positioned herself to sound the ancient instrument. The carved symbols seemed to watch her with the wisdom of generations who had faced similar desperate moments. "Wait," Mira said suddenly. "Someone's coming up fast ahead of the main group." Elena looked down and saw a single figure climbing with inhuman speed up the treacherous path. Even at this distance, she could make out the rich clothing and imperious bearing of Baron Corvus himself. "He's not waiting for his men," Aldric observed. "He's making a direct assault." The Baron's voice carried clearly in the thin mountain air as he shouted orders to his trailing soldiers. "Surround the summit. They have nowhere to run." Elena realized their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. In minutes, Baron Corvus would reach positions where an avalanche couldn't touch him. They had to act now, or lose their only advantage. She lifted the ancient horn to her lips, drew the deepest breath of her life, and prepared to wake the sleeping mountains. The sound that emerged from the ancient horn was like the voice of the mountain itself, deep, primal, echoing off every peak and cliff face for miles around. Elena felt the vibration through her bones as the instrument released centuries of stored power, calling to the unstable snow masses that clung to the steep slopes above the climbing soldiers. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then the mountain answered. The avalanche began not as Elena had imagined, not with a sudden roar and rush of snow, but with a whisper, a subtle shifting of the white mass clinging to the highest peaks, a gentle release that grew and gathered momentum as it descended. "Elena!" Mira shouted over the growing rumble. "They're coming." Baron Corvus had reached the summit platform faster than any of them had anticipated. He stood 50 yards away, sword drawn, his face twisted with rage and desperation. Behind him, 3 of his fastest soldiers had kept pace, emerging onto the summit just as the avalanche began to build. "You think you can escape me?" the Baron roared, advancing with deadly purpose. "Those documents die with you. Here, now." Aldric moved to intercept him, but the Baron's soldiers spread out, attempting to flank them. Elena realized with crystal clarity that they were trapped. The avalanche they had triggered would cut off the Baron's retreat, but it wouldn't save them from the immediate threat of armed men who had nothing left to lose. "Surrender the documents, and I'll make your deaths quick," Baron Corvus commanded, his blade glinting in the afternoon light. Elena clutched their bundle tighter, the village records that had started this entire chase still wrapped within. "These documents will reach the king's auditors, whether we live or die. No one will believe the word of dead refugees." The rumble of the avalanche was growing louder, but Elena could see it was still several minutes away from reaching the soldiers climbing below. The Baron's remaining men would have time to escape if they retreated now, but Baron Corvus himself seemed determined to finish this personal confrontation, regardless of the consequences. Mira stepped forward, her wooden doll clutched in one hand. "You murdered our parents. You burned our village. You stole tax money that belonged to the crown." "I did what was necessary to maintain order in chaotic times," the Baron snarled. Your parents were casualties of a greater purpose. Something changed in Mira's expression, a hardening that Elena had never seen before. Her little sister, who had always been the dreamer, the optimist, suddenly looked every inch their mother's daughter. "No," Mira said clearly. "You stole from the dead and murdered the living to hide your theft. That's not order, that's cowardice." Baron Corvus raised his sword, but before he could strike, Aldric was between them. The vampire moved with inhuman speed, intercepting the Baron's blade with his bare hands. Steel rang against supernatural flesh as Aldric caught the sword in his grip. "You face me now," Aldric said, his voice carrying 8 centuries of controlled violence. The Baron's eyes widened as he realized what he was fighting. "Demon," he breathed. "Perhaps. But I'm a demon who protects the innocent." Aldric twisted the sword from the Baron's grip with effortless strength, but the Baron's soldiers were closing in. Elena saw steel flashing in the afternoon light, saw Mira backing toward the edge of the platform where the path dropped away into nothingness. The avalanche was building momentum now, its voice becoming a roar that shook the mountain itself. Elena could see the white wall descending toward the climbing soldiers below, but she realized with horror that some of them might escape, might retreat to safety, and continue the hunt. Unless... Elena looked at the ancient horn, still warm from her breath, then at the precipice where Mira stood cornered. A desperate plan formed in her mind, born of love and determination, and the kind of courage that only comes when everything precious is at stake. "Mira!" she called out. "The horn!" Her sister understood immediately. While Aldric grappled with Baron Corvus and his soldiers advanced with drawn weapons, Elena lifted the ancient instrument again. But this time, instead of aiming the blast toward the avalanche zones, she turned it toward the summit itself. The sound that emerged was different, sharper, more focused. It struck the unstable cornices of snow and ice that overhung the summit platform like a hammer blow. Elena watched in awe and terror as the very ground they stood on began to shift. "What have you done?" Baron Corvus screamed, but his words were lost in the growing thunder of collapsing snow and ice. Elena had triggered not just an avalanche in the valleys below, but a localized slide that would reshape the summit itself. The ancient horn clattered from her hands as the platform began to break apart. Mira reached her first, grabbing Elena's hand just as the stone beneath their feet started to give way. Aldric, still locked in combat with Baron Corvus, looked back with eyes that held both admiration and alarm. Elena had solved their problem, but she might have doomed them all in the process. The summit was collapsing, and there was nowhere left to run. Elena's first sensation was warmth. After what felt like hours of cold mountain air and the terror of collapsing stone, she woke to find herself wrapped in thick furs beside a crackling fireplace. Soft morning light streamed through diamond-paned windows, and the air carried the scent of bread baking and herbs drying. For a moment, she wondered if everything, the chase, the mountain, the avalanche, had been an elaborate dream. Then she saw Mira sleeping peacefully in the bed beside her, still clutching her wooden doll, and memory came flooding back. "You're awake." Aldric's voice came from a chair near the window, where he sat reading by the early sunlight. He looked different, rested, no longer carrying the weight of starvation and guilt that had shadowed his features since they met. "Where are we?" Elena asked, sitting up carefully. Her body ached, but she seemed to be uninjured. "Ravenshollow, a free city beyond the mountain passes, where Baron Corvus's authority cannot reach." Aldric closed his book and moved to her bedside. "You've been sleeping for 2 days." 2 days? Elena looked around the comfortable room with its solid stone walls and cheerful furnishings. "How did we? The summit was collapsing. You triggered an avalanche that buried Baron Corvus and most of his men. The few soldiers who escaped have no interest in pursuing fugitives into foreign territory without their master's gold to motivate them." Aldric's expression grew thoughtful. "Your decision to bring down the summit was either the most brilliant tactical move I've witnessed in 8 centuries, or the most fortunate accident. Elena tried to remember those final moments on the mountain, the platform breaking apart, Mira's hand in hers, the terrible sound of stone and snow reshaping the peak. You saved us. We saved each other. You created the opportunity. Mira had the courage to leap when the moment came. I simply provided the means to survive the fall. Aldric gestured toward the window. The people of Ravenshollow are familiar with refugees from the mountain passes. They didn't ask uncomfortable questions about how 3 people managed to survive what appeared to be a major avalanche. Mira stirred in the bed beside her, blue eyes opening to focus on Elena with immediate concern. Sister, are you hurt? I'm fine. Elena reached out to squeeze Mira's hand. We're safe. Baron Corvus? Gone. Aldric's voice held finality. The mountain claimed him and his ambitions together. Elena felt a complex mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and something that might have been justice. She had never wanted to cause anyone's death, but the Baron had made his own choices. He had chosen greed over honor, violence over mercy, and ultimately pursuit over survival. The documents, she said suddenly. The village records. Safe. Aldric produced their bundle from a nearby table. And already copied. The city magistrate here has connections to the royal court. Your evidence of the Baron's tax fraud has been sent to the king's auditors, along with testimony about his other crimes. Mira sat up, looking around their comfortable surroundings with wonder. This is really a free city. We're truly safe? As safe as anyone can be in this world, Aldric confirmed. Ravenshollow has laws that protect refugees. No one can be extradited for crimes against corrupt nobles, and the city guard takes that responsibility seriously. Elena rose from the bed and walked to the window, looking out over a bustling city that showed no signs of plague, war, or winter's hardships. People moved through the streets below with the easy confidence of those who lived under just laws and capable protection. What happens now? She asked. Now, you build new lives. Aldric replied. The magistrate has found positions for you both, Elena. There's a healer here who could use an apprentice with your practical experience. Mira, the city's scholars are always seeking bright young people to help with their work. Elena turned to study Aldric's face. And you? I'll remain nearby for a while, long enough to ensure you're truly settled and safe. Something in his expression suggested this decision hadn't been easy. After that, I'm not certain. For the first time in centuries, I find myself curious about the future instead of burdened by the past. Mira climbed out of bed and moved to stand beside Elena at the window. Will you visit us? Would you want me to? Yes. Mira's answer was immediate and certain. Your family now. Not the family we were born to, but the family we chose. Elena nodded agreement. We started this journey as 3 strangers brought together by desperation. We're ending it as something different. What are we then? Aldric asked. Elena considered the question. They weren't bound by blood, marriage, or any conventional relationship. They were bound by something deeper, shared suffering, mutual protection, and the decision to care for each other when caring served no practical purpose. We're proof, she said finally, that family isn't about what you're born with. It's about what you choose to protect. Months passed. Elena indeed became apprenticed to Master Thorn, the city's most skilled healer, learning to combine her natural knowledge of herbs with formal medical training. Mira found her place among the scholars, her quick mind and gentle nature making her invaluable in their work, preserving ancient knowledge. Aldric remained true to his promise, appearing when they needed him but never imposing his presence. Sometimes they would find him waiting in their small house when they returned from work, bringing news from the wider world or simply sharing a quiet evening by their fire. Other times, weeks would pass without word until one of them would notice a shadowy figure watching their windows from across the street, ensuring their safety from a distance. The wooden doll that Mira had carried through their ordeal found a place of honor on their mantelpiece, a reminder of the innocence they had managed to preserve despite everything the world had taken from them. Sometimes Elena would catch her sister talking to it, as she had when they were children, sharing dreams of the future instead of memories of loss. On winter evenings, when snow fell softly outside their windows and warmth filled their small home, the three of them would sit together and speak of many things: books Mira was reading, patients Elena was helping to heal, places Aldric had travelled in his long existence. They never spoke directly of love, but it lived in the spaces between their words, in the way they protected each other's peace, in their shared understanding that some bonds transcend every rule the world tries to impose. Sometimes, Elena thought, the greatest strength was simply the courage to care for others, when caring brought no reward except the knowledge that love, once given freely, could never truly be lost. In a world where so much was taken without warning, they had found something that could not be stolen: the family they had chosen to become, and the new dawn that waited beyond every mountain pass, no matter how treacherous the climb.